Great, thank you.
Sounds good.
Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar on COVID-19 vaccine. Sorry, having a minute. I'm trying to turn my camera on. There we go. Oh, it won't let me. Okay, so welcome to the COVID-19 vaccine and HIV webinar. Today's webinar will be recorded. The recording along with a written summary will be provided via email. To protect everyone's identity, no faces or names will be visible during the webinar or the recording. I am pleased to introduce today's presenters, Dr. Christopher Leckie, Infectious Disease Specialist, and Bryant Foberg, Infectious Disease Pharmacy Resident at Munson Medical Center. If you have any questions during the webinar, please click on the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen and then type them into the box. These questions will be monitored and I will bring them to the attention of our providers. Thank you both for being here and doing the webinar for us.
No problem.
Pleasure.
So as far as I understand, I think this is supposed to be like a question and answer session, and we have some questions that we were already sent. So I'm just going to kind of jump into those. And Bryant, just interrupt me if you have anything to add, okay?
Okay, sounds great.
So one of the concerns that we hear a lot is how were these vaccines made so quickly, which is concerning, to the general population because science is not typically something that is rushed. But basically, so in reality, making a vaccine before COVID would typically be a multi-year process, typically with millions of dollars invested. And that would be a risk for the manufacturer because they would have to invest quite a bit of money before realizing whether or not it actually worked or not. So it would be a big risk for a manufacturer to make a vaccine, and it was done commonly, and many of those failed, and many of those, cost a lot of money to develop. So this is a completely different scenario where the pharmaceutical companies making these vaccines, particularly the US-based ones, are government funded. So they had funding through Operation Warp Speed through the US government to invest in producing a vaccine, and whether or not the vaccine worked, whether or not it was effective or not, or safe or not, the pharmaceutical manufacturer wasn't taking that risk. So there was a big financial incentive and a lack of risk, more importantly, for them to develop these. It was also, a large collaboration between scientific companies and government agencies to the effect that we haven't seen before. So the combination of a large amount of funding and a huge collaboration led to these vaccines being produced significantly faster than they typically would. They did still include large populations for safety data, which is something that was kind of imperative to maintain public trust. So there was still, what we would typically require is something like 3 months of safety analysis in a large population of typically tens of thousands of patients. And even though this was done quickly, that analysis was still possible. So though it seemed rushed, they still were able to do the typical safety data monitoring that they have been doing in the past. Anything to add, Bryant?
Yeah, and then I just wanted to highlight again that the vaccines did go through all the proper avenues that any other vaccine or medication would go through the government agency. So they did go through the same exact process of the review system. And the reason why the vaccines were so able to reach their outcomes needed for the study so quickly is because we know how contagious COVID-19 is. So the faster the disease spreads, the more people that get infected, it's easier to reach those outcomes faster. So that's why we're able to reach the outcomes much faster for COVID-19 compared to something like another virus such as influenza, where it may take a little bit longer to see large amounts of people infected. So that's all I wanted to highlight there.
Thanks, Bryant. Okay, so a lot of talk about this mRNA vaccine and what is it and why haven't we seen it before? This technology is actually not new. This is something that has been studied before. It's been used in cancer research. It is a relatively high technology. It requires the virus itself to be sequenced, which is something that in the past would have taken a long time. And now with the technology we have, we were able to sequence this quickly. And because we have the genetic sequence of the virus, we're able to take specific portions of that genome that would elicit an appropriate immune response, and we're able to take that and create an RNA, an mRNA, a messenger RNA strand that we can use in vaccine manufacturing. So one of the reasons we haven't seen it as a vaccine before is because, again, it's relatively difficult to get that genome sequencing, which is relatively new technology. But in addition to that, the storage of genetic material is difficult because it degrades really quickly in the environment. So it necessitates a really cold storage process, and most pharmacies and hospitals wouldn't have had that. So it required the establishment of a cold storage system that wasn't available before as well. Anything else, Brian?
No, that was it. That's everything I could think of. But the biggest thing to just highlight there too was the difficulty in storing and transporting this vaccine, because it has to be monitored at all times due to the fact that it has such a very narrow area of temperatures it needs to be kept at to make sure it stays active. And then we kind of already touched on the was it rush part. So as you mentioned before, I went all through the appropriate channels for approval. So I think we can go to the next slide. Okay. Go ahead, Chris.
Sure. Is there any difference between the available vaccines? So there were two different vaccines that were approved under emergency use by the FDA in December, and both of these are mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer and the Moderna. And they have essentially identical mechanism of action, which is they produce they allow human cells to produce this spike protein that the coronavirus has, that the immune system then makes appropriate antibodies to. There are differences in storage for these vaccines. The efficacy is very similar. It's in the it's in the mid 90s as far as protection. There are differences in the time frame for first and second dose. For example, the Pfizer vaccine would be given at day 0 and day 21, whereas the Moderna vaccine is day 0 and day 28. The age indication is a little bit different, over 16 for Pfizer, over 18 for Moderna. They both looked at large populations in their efficacy and safety data, with Pfizer looking almost 44,000 patients and Moderna about 30,000. So those are the mRNA vaccines. There are lots and lots of other vaccines that are being developed that have different modalities, like the adenovirus vaccine, for example, that you may hear about down the road. But the ones that are available right now are, again, mRNA and have a very similar characteristics.
Yeah, I don't have anything else to add. I think you hit all the key points there.
So in the efficacy studies for both Pfizer and Moderna, what they do is they have a placebo arm and they have a vaccine arm, and they follow these populations and they look for natural infection. Like what they're looking for is symptomatic COVID that would occur naturally. So in order to do that, they have to monitor these patients closely, and they document how many in the placebo arm develop COVID and how many in the vaccine arm. And you see a really big divergence about 2 weeks after the first dose is given, where there are very, very few cases in the vaccine arm, and ongoing high-level transmission in the placebo arm. So basically, it's about 95% effective with those 2 doses for both Moderna and Pfizer vaccines. So as far as efficacy and protection, they're very, very effective.
I agree. Yeah, nothing else to add for that either.
Okay, is it safe? Yes, this is I think probably one of the most important things we need to talk about. So you have to understand that not only are they looking for development of COVID in these populations, but they are monitoring for adverse effects. And so this is a large population of patients that they're looking, and their threshold to halt everything and reanalyze is very low. So if they've had a patient or two that had a specific development of new symptoms or something, they would stop everything and look at those cases. And you saw that happen with like the AstraZeneca adenovirus vaccine. They had to stop everything because they were concerned about development of specific neurologic condition. But in general, the side effects were very, very mild. Some pain at the injection site. There was occasionally, fever, some fatigue, things like that. Very rare cases of an allergic reaction. Probably what I was seeing is somewhere around 10 or 11 per million doses. So very, very rare, and something we are monitoring for, but again, very, very rare and very safe from what we can see. Anything to add, Brian?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention some of my experience. So I've personally been involved with, vaccinating around almost 1,000 people here at Munson Healthcare already, the employees that have been available. And from my experience of what we've seen is that, people have been feeling a little worse for a couple day or two afterwards, just very fatigued, very tired. Does have some arm pain that lasts for about a day or two at the site of injection, but as long as you keep that arm active and keep it moving, it seems to really help reduce those onsets of the short-term side effects. And then also we have had a very small amount of patients have any kind of adverse effect to the vaccine, and most of what we've seen so far are things not necessarily related to the vaccine itself, but to the process of getting a vaccine. A lot of people have some very nervous reactions, like very nervous. They get very nervous and they tend to have some reactions anytime they get a vaccine. So we have seen some of those, but we have not seen any major safety concerns at Munson Healthcare as of right now. And then long-term side effects, very similar to any other vaccine, are very limited as well too. So that's one of the big concerns, is that, we don't know the long-term side effects. It just came out, but this is very similar to any other medication where we will be giving it and then continuously monitoring after it's given. And like very many other vaccines, it's unlikely to have any long-term side effects. And it's always a risk for benefit discussion. So we know with COVID-19, there are many long-term side effects with symptomatic COVID. Many patients, develop long-term health conditions, such as some cardiac issues, as long as lung dysfunctions, lung structure changes that really cause them a lot of damage after COVID. So remember, always we're comparing risk and benefits with these vaccines as well too.
Okay, will it affect my HIV treatment or my health because I have HIV? So it will not in any manner affect the treatment of your HIV. It does not have any drug interactions. It does not act systemically. So it shouldn't interact with any medications. It should not affect your body's response to HIV. It should not affect the transmissibility of HIV. There have, just so you guys know, there have been patients with HIV included in both the Moderna and the Pfizer trials. And so that's part of this study. They were not excluded. And there were no safety concerns in those patients in that study. Anything else, Brian?
Nope. And then Chris briefly, or Dr. Leckie briefly just mentioned about this, but just wanted to highlight that for most, no HIV medications have any direct interactions with the vaccine because the vaccine does not act systemically. And then as long as that too, there are some, if there's people on very immunosuppressive drugs that are not related to HIV. So for example, patients that have rheumatoid arthritis that are on, immunosuppressant drugs, there are some recommendations to stop those medications before receiving the vaccine, and that's just not for safety concerns, but more of an efficacy concern. If you're taking very immunosuppressive drugs, then you may not have an effect to the vaccine, but that does not apply to HIV medications. They are not widely immunosuppressive that would impact antibody development.
Yeah, we get this question a lot, is will it alter your DNA? Will it alter your genetics? And it needs to be very clear that it has no involvement with your DNA or your genome. So basically, what it does is the RNA is part of this vaccine, and it's basically surrounded by this like lipid layer that allows it to not get degraded within human tissue. And then it gets taken up into cells, and it does not enter the nucleus where your DNA is. It does not affect your DNA at all. It goes into the cytoplasm, which is kind of the inner portion of the cell, and it's utilized by some of the organelles, some of the parts of your cell to make the protein. So your cells are full of different types of RNA, and all the time. So it's standard to have just, different types of mRNA all over the place. And that's consistent with, any, not even in the vaccine world, but any viral infection, that's what it does. It utilizes your protein manufacturing process to make more viruses. That's how it reproduces. So in this case, it's kind of using that same process in the cell cytoplasm to make the protein that gets expressed to your body's immune cells, but it does not go into the nucleus. It does not affect DNA, and that has not been a concern.
And then it looks like we do have a question in the chat. So what about pregnancy, in regards to pregnancy?
Yeah, so the way that the CDC states is that if a patient who's pregnant or breastfeeding wishes to get the vaccine, then they should be able to get it. Like in the healthcare field, for example, in hospital employees, we have been vaccinating them. The caveat is that pregnancy was an exclusion criteria for these efficacy and safety trials. So there is a lack of data in pregnancy, but there's no reason to think that this would be that this would have adverse effects of pregnancy or to a fetus that would be biologically plausible. So we have not had any reservations in vaccinating pregnant patients, and we've been doing that at the hospital and haven't had any problems with that.
Yeah, and that includes breastfeeding as well too. That's another
Yeah, with
concern that I
breastfeeding.
commonly hear.
Yep.
Yep, same idea with breastfeeding as well too.
Yeah, when and where? That is a good question. So we are still in the process at Munson of vaccinating hospital employees and healthcare workers. And I don't know if you saw in the news, but I think that Michigan is very, very aggressively going to start vaccinating first responders and patients of a certain age. And then from what I can tell, based on their kind of flow chart, it looks like patients living with HIV will be technically 1C, phase 1C or priority 1C, which according to their projections will probably have them vaccinated sometime in April or May. Although it's likely that that will change, and hopefully it'll be much sooner than that. But from what I can tell, they'll be considered 1C, patients with HIV.
Yeah, and then also it's very dependent on our supply of vaccine as well too, and that can change drastically at any time. They're definitely ramping up their vaccine production now, as they have been, so it's very dependent on that. And then I just wanted to highlight there's three main groups of people vaccinating people right now. So there's hospital systems vaccinating employees. There are CVS and Walgreens have signed a contract to vaccinate long-term care facilities, and then there's the state health department that is also working on immunizing the community. And I do want to mention that the state of health, or the health community, is working with Munson to help produce clinics. So eventually, once we get all our employees vaccinated, we will likely be helping out the state and vaccinating peoples in the community, and there's ongoing discussions there that are interacting very closely with each and every one from those departments. So and I know they do have some potential locations thought of about where to do some of the mass vaccination clinics in Traverse City, but I can't release those details quite yet because they're not finalized.
We have gotten another question. Given its frailty and its handling protocol, is the vaccine quality control checked before administration to ensure it's viable?
Yeah, so I can answer that. I've been highly active in the process of handling the vaccines. So specifically the Pfizer product is the one that is a little bit more sensitive because it does require that much colder deep freeze compared to the Moderna product. And how we monitor is that it's monitored throughout the entire process temperature-wise, from time it's in the shipment. Its shipment comes with a GPS locator and a temperature monitor on it, and then once we transfer it into our freezers and then refrigerators, it is closely monitored with temperature logs continuously throughout that entire time, up until the point that we don't draw out vaccines out of the fridge until we know we have enough patients there for that day. And then as the pharmacy team really controls the flow of the vaccine, it's always within a close eye and monitoring and making sure it meets those appropriate standards for delivery to ensure it's efficacious. So it's continuously monitored. It's never really forgot about, and that's one of the biggest things that from a pharmacist, what our jobs is really ensuring that we do everything we can to ensure the stability and viability of that vaccine.
There was another question.
Yeah, I can address that.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so this is really important. So these mRNA vaccines, the COVID vaccines that you would have access to, do not give you COVID virus, do not give you the disease. It's a small component of the, it's the spike protein that is on the surface of the virus that is being created by your cell through the mRNA. It is not the whole virus. It's not an inactivated virus. It's not a live virus. So you would never get COVID from this vaccine. So the only reason that they talk about vaccination protocols in patients with immune suppression, like transplant patients or rheumatologic patients or patients with HIV, it's not because there's safety concerns. Like as I said, you wouldn't get COVID. The concern would be, are you going to have an appropriate immune response to the vaccine? So even with a relatively low CD4 count, you could easily have a good, robust immune response and be protected. But you would never get the COVID virus from that vaccine because it's not the virus. It's only a portion of it. Is there anybody that shouldn't get the vaccine? So Bryant, correct me if I'm wrong, the only contraindication I'm aware of is, first of all, well, I guess patients who actively have COVID because they don't want to spread COVID to those who are doing the administration. So that would be one contraindication. And then patients who have anaphylaxis or a severe allergic reaction to any of the components of the vaccine, which would be available like on the CDC's website. Other than that, I'm not aware of any contraindications unless you are, Bryant.
That's correct. That's the only contraindication is a anaphylactic reaction to a component of the vaccine that is present in that vaccine. But overall, from a non-contraindication point, in a general perspective, there's not anybody that really shouldn't get the vaccine. They haven't outlined any special populations that should not get the vaccine at this time outside of that contraindication. So I think Dr. Leckie briefly touched on this. How do I know if I'm allergic to any of the ingredients? So the ingredients of the vaccines are present on the CDC website, and if you do a simple Google search, you should be able to find those as easily as well too. They are very clean vaccines overall. They don't have a whole lot of they don't have any preservatives. They don't have a lot of weird ingredients that would cause cross reactivities between food allergies or any things along that. So there, like I mentioned, there's only been about 2 million doses. There's only been about 21 anaphylactic reactions, and a lot of those patients had anaphylactic reactions in the past to other things, and mostly they did have it to some other vaccine. But if you haven't had an anaphylactic reaction, but you had a reaction that necessarily wasn't anaphylaxis to another vaccine, you are still able to get the vaccine. It's not a preclusion from that as long as it wasn't a severe anaphylactic reaction.
Yeah, these vaccines don't really have like the preservatives and the additives that some of the other vaccines have, which is part of the reason why you need to keep it at such a low temperature. And like other vaccines, like, I mean, almost anything, influenza, things like that, they have components of that vaccine that kind of enhance your local immune response. And that's not really necessary in these vaccines because of their methodology, because of the way that they work. It's using your immune system's own response to foreign proteins. So it doesn't need to like ramp up your immune system like some of these other vaccines. So there's very minimal additives. There's really no preservatives. So it's like Brian said, it's incredibly clean. Any reports of patients being paralyzed? So I think what this is referencing is there is an association with some vaccines in the past with something called Guillain-Barré, which is a neurologic syndrome, and things like transverse myelitis. There's been no evidence of that associated with the COVID vaccines. There was a few cases of something called Bell's palsy in the some of the these large population safety and efficacy studies, but they determined that it was a small enough cases that they thought it was that was consistent with the development in the general population. So there was no specific association with the vaccine itself.
Great, nothing to add for that.
I'm going to go to a question. Actually, we have a question. Somebody who lives in a rural area, where would I go and when will I know? That's a good question. I think probably your best bet is to wait on the local health department, and they typically, it depends on the county you live in, but I know like Grand Traverse County has a pretty a decent website with updated information. So I would be watching the local health department website closely, and I would also be in touch with your primary care provider regarding when you would be eligible. But again, it depends on the county. Anything else to add there, Brian?
No, and then always just watching out for your local news, because I'm sure as the health department releases information, we'll try to spread it to all avenues as possible, and they may directly contact you as well too. I know that we've received a list of eligible patients fitting into some early criteria, so they have a way of getting in contact with you, but always keep your ears and eyes open for some releases from the health department itself.
Okay, if I already had COVID, should I still get the vaccine? This is a question we get a lot, and it's a completely reasonable, good question. So according to the CDC, their vaccine recommendations are irrelevant of COVID status. So whether or not you have COVID, whether or not you have recently had COVID, they still want you to get the vaccine. With the caveat being that if you are actively contagious, they don't want you to come in and expose those who are giving the administration. But if you've had COVID like a month ago, 2 months ago, they still want you to get the vaccine. And some of that is because we have a good amount of data because we're prospectively following patients who have been given the vaccine. We have good data on protection in the setting of vaccination, and protection in the setting of natural infection isn't as reliable. And so I think they'd like to get as many patients vaccinated as possible, even if you have had COVID. Will the vaccine be mandatory? So it will not be mandatory as far as I'm aware. It is an emergency use product, and so even in the hospital setting, it's not mandatory for employees. But I hope that anybody who has access to it would get it.
Right, and then there's been rumors that have been posted on the internet. I think another thing that's driving this is that there's been reports of maybe potentially requiring it for travel, but that's all it is just speculation and reports. There's no strong evidence to say that it will be mandatory for any future travel. So at this time, that's just hearsay and rumors at this point.
So can you get the shot with other vaccines? So because it's relatively early in this process and they don't know how it will act in the setting of other vaccines, they're recommending a 2-week separation between other vaccines and the COVID vaccine series.
Yep, nothing to add there.
So do I need to get both shots, or is one good enough? Keep in mind that the data looking at how these vaccines act and how well they work is based on a 2-dose series. So it's inadequate at this time to recommend a single dose. And I think if you're going to get 1 dose, you might as well just get both doses so that you're fully protected. And so yes, you need to get both shots.
The only people who shouldn't get a second shot is what's recommended are people that have had moderate to severe allergic reaction specifically to their first shot. So if a person does have a anaphylactic reaction to the first shot, they should not be getting the second shot. But for all other people, a second shot is still recommended currently, and that is also for people that have mild non-allergic reactions. So if you had some tingling in your fingers, or you just weren't feeling well for the next day, that it's still recommended to receive your second vaccine.
Is there a microchip in the vaccine? There is no microchip in the vaccine. So I guess this outlines what I would call a large amount of misinformation that you might encounter if you look at specific sources online. I would just be very careful what you read and what you believe. There is no microchip in the vaccine.
Then like I mentioned, I've handled hundreds and hundreds of vaccine vials, and they're all very clear liquids, or so it's just a lot of misinformation being spread. So there's a question in the chat stating, do we have to worry about the other 2 strains? Will this vaccine still be good, or stop getting the other strains that are currently out there?
Yeah, so from what we could tell so far, the vaccine will still be effective. And keep in mind that what this vaccine is doing is presenting basically the entire spike protein to your immune cells. And so the virus would have to create multiple mutations in that specific protein in order for the vaccine to not become effective. It's not just one site, like your antibodies attach and encounter this protein at multiple sites. So from what we could tell, the vaccine should still be effective against particularly the South African and the UK variants that you might hear about in the news.
Yeah, and I think I did see some more information on that today, that Pfizer and Moderna have done some preliminary studies, and it looks to still be effective against those strains as of right now. But obviously, we need more information to be 100% confident on that. But I would be very confident that it would cover those strains, because any large enough mutation to cause a change in the spike protein that would make the vaccine useless would probably either significantly decrease or prevent the virus from actually attaching to the human cells. So it's another thing to keep in mind.
There was one more question that came in late. If somebody's vaccinated and contracts COVID, will they still be transmissible?
So yeah, this is a good question. This comes up quite a bit too. And I think what you're probably aiming at is, are you still able to transmit COVID after the vaccine? And keep in mind that what these studies looked at was symptomatic, a natural COVID after vaccine administration. So they were not testing for asymptomatic disease. That would be a much larger trial. You'd have to test 70,000 patients. You'd have to test them regularly, like once a week maybe, for COVID to determine whether or not it prevents asymptomatic spread. Now, those studies are being done. I mean, biologically, there's no reason to think that you would shed live virus after appropriate vaccination, just based on how the vaccine works. I mean, the virus would have to enter your body and use that same process to make more of its own. And if there's antibodies to it, it shouldn't be able to do that. So I don't see how you would be able to be an asymptomatic COVID case after vaccination, with the caveat being that those studies haven't been done.
And it's always important to highlight that if you do hear stories of other people that I got my COVID vaccine and then I tested positive with COVID, that most likely situation is because that person was exposed to COVID prior to their vaccination, and they were infected prior to their vaccination, but hadn't developed symptoms till after their vaccination. So if you do hear other people mention that, that's a possibility that they would, like Dr. Like you mentioned, you never get it from the vaccine itself, but it's possible to be exposed and not develop symptoms till after because you've already infected. It does take some time to develop symptoms after initial exposure. And then there's another question in the chat. How will I know that my body produced an appropriate response to the vaccine?
So there's no, like you wouldn't feel it. There would be no difference in symptoms. You could conceivably check antibodies, and it has to be the right type of antibody test. And we aren't actually recommending that for post-vaccination patients, but theoretically you could have an antibody check. And there's two different types of antibodies. There's antibodies that check for the spike protein, and there's antibodies that check for nucleocapsid. And the spike protein antibodies would be positive with natural infection and with immunization, whereas the nucleocapsid would only be positive with natural infection. Again, we aren't necessarily recommending that, but there are ways to confirm that you've had an appropriate response. Now, keep in mind that that's not an absolute. Positive antibodies does not directly correlate with protection. You can definitely be protected with negative antibody testing. So it's a little bit of an oversimplification. So again, there are ways that you can test that, but we aren't recommending it. It's a little bit hard to interpret. Anything else, Brian?
There's no more questions in the chat.
It looks like that's it. So I would like to thank you guys again for speaking with all of the clients and answering some questions on the vaccine. And hopefully this was helpful for everyone.
Happy to help.
Thank you.
As well. Thank you.
Thanks.